Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us from Idea to Implementation, a Ranked Choice Voting and Voting System Symposium. Our 10th and final session, Universal RCV Tabulator, will begin shortly. My name is Karen Brinson Bell, and I am a member of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center consulting team, and I will be your moderator for this session. A few housekeeping matters are needed before we get started. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a large number of attendees. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. If you have a question or comment regarding the session, please type that message in the question box. Session 6 will be about 20 minutes, followed by a brief question and answer period. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website within a couple of weeks of the symposium. Now let's welcome George Gilbert, a fellow consultant with the Resource Center, who will briefly share some information about the Resource Center and introduce the panelists who will be joining him for this session.
Thank you, Karen. If any of you participated in the webinars by the major vendors this afternoon, you saw that each of them currently has to offer in terms of ranked choice voting, ballot layout, and tabulation. A year ago, most of these presentations would not have been possible. This was a situation that Gary Bartlett and I found when this project began 3 years ago. The single greatest hurdle to overcome in implementing ranked choice voting was the lack of RCV software with existing election management systems, particularly tabulation software. We, of course, did not have the expertise to fill this gap, but knew it was a critical link in the implementation chain. We began working with the NIST public working groups on voting methods by identifying all the legal requirements that applied to the existing RCV elections in the United States. In addition, the Resource Center undertook to identify all existing voting systems used in the U.S. that are capable of generating a digital cast vote record. And we began collecting sample cast vote records for these systems to facilitate conversion of the various data formats to a single format to be used by the universal tabulator we dreamed of building. Then, about a year ago, we were introduced to Bright Spots. Bright Spots is a small group of friends based in San Francisco Bay Area who have united over their shared commitment to supporting both shorter-term progressive causes and longer-term nonpartisan democratic reforms. They identify promising organizations aligned with their values and then seek to amplify the impact of those organizations by contributing financial support or engaging in pro bono specialized projects. In our case, we were a pro bono specialized project. A member of this group was Charlotte Hill, who serves on the board of Fair Vote and is married to Louis Eisenberg, also a Bright Spots participant. Louis is a software engineering manager at Chang Zuckerberg Initiative, where he works on a team developing educational technology to develop personalized learning for schools around the country. John Moldover is originally from Rockville, Maryland, and also now lives in San Francisco. John is a professional software engineer with over 15 years of industry experience and a background in political science and music. He and Louis represent the original core of the Bright Spots group working on the RCV with the RCV Resource Center on the Universal Tabulator. Recently, we've been joined by Hilton Edenfield. Hilton's career spanned working as a mathematician, a music producer, an English language teacher, an environmental scientist, and most recently a software engineer. He's passionate about politics and social choice theory, So in his free time, he designed and developed GroupAgree, a ranked pairs voting app that you can use for free at groupagree.com. He is currently a senior technical solutions engineer at Google, and he is working on our user interface. And finally today, Caleb Kleppner, who is co-founder of MK Election Services, has been long affiliated with Fair Vote and ranked choice voting. Caleb worked to bring about the first new RCV implementation in decades, beginning in the late 1990s in San Francisco. He now supports numerous private as well as public sector elections and has executed the RCV tabulation in a number of current jurisdictions where it is used. Last fall, Caleb joined the project on behalf of the Resource Center to help translate our administrative and legal knowledge of RCV into the technical language John and Lewis and Hilton needed to build the tabulation module. So I will now turn you over to Caleb to introduce you to the Universal RCV Tabulator in its current state of development.
Thanks, George. This is Caleb, and I'm going to give you an overview of how the Universal Ranked Choice Voting Tabulator works. And then I will turn it over to the developers from Bright Spots to get into a few of the more technical details. So the main thing I want to summarize is that we recognize that there are election officials out there who can get a hold of rankings from their voters, but they didn't have a way of performing the tabulation. So our first audience is those election administrators who have rankings, but didn't have a method of tallying those rankings according to the ranked choice voting rules of that jurisdiction. Our second audience is election administrators who are trying to run a ranked choice voting election, but have more than one voting system. So they have ranked ballot data coming from more than one system in different formats. And I don't think any of the current vendors can accommodate rankings from different systems. So we want to be able to help out a jurisdiction that has more than one voting system and has rankings from more than one format. Our third group that we want to be able to assist is an election official who has a tabulation software but wants to perform an independent verification of that to boost public confidence in the outcome of the elections. And our last group, which may be just as important as the others, is to empower citizens to independently verify tabulations that are performed by public officials. Now, a ranked choice voting tabulator isn't an exceptionally complex piece of software. The inputs are basically a set of definitions that tell you who the candidates are, what the rules of the race are, and what the source of the cast vote records are. So there's really just two inputs for any ranked choice voting election. It's going to be some kind of election configuration, the candidates, the rules, and then the source or sources of the cast vote records. Our goal for the Universal Ranked Choice Voting Tabulator is to support cast vote records from all current vendors out there, including legacy equipment, and to support all variations on ranked choice voting that are currently being used. And that means we want to be able to handle all the parameters that relate to things such as how you handle overvotes. There's not a single way that this is being currently handled in US elections. So we have all the parameters for overvotes that we have been able to identify. Jurisdictions have different rules on skipped rankings. They handle the issue of a candidate being ranked more than once differently. Voting systems support different numbers of rankings. Jurisdictions have different rules on bulk elimination and, of course, as well, tie breaking. So these are the kinds of parameters that you need to put into your election configuration, your election definition, to perform a tabulation. The outputs of a ranked choice voting tabulation are also relatively straightforward. The first output is the election results, which really consists of vote totals for each candidate in each round of the tabulation. And that's the difference between a traditional plurality race. Instead of having vote totals, one vote total for each candidate in a ranked choice voting election, you have a vote total for each candidate in each round, and that tells you what happened in the election. The other thing we do is we produce a very detailed audit log that shows how each individual ranking was tabulated in each step of the entire counting process. In terms of performance, with our system, we tabulated the actual cast vote records from the Minneapolis mayor's race of 2013. There were 80,000 votes. There were 35 candidates in this race. It took 33 rounds of counting, and our tabulator did the job in 11 seconds. We then wanted to look at a load test to see if the system had the capacity to handle the kind of vote totals you might get in a statewide gubernatorial election. So I ran a test with 1 million votes. It was based on the Minneapolis mayor's race, repeating the cast vote records multiple times. Again, 35 candidates, 33 rounds of counting. We tabulated that in 3 minutes, and this was all tabulated on a standard laptop, not especially fast. So the system is very robust. It's very fast. Let me just very quickly show you what it's like to run a tabulation. So here is a graphical user interface you'll hear a little bit more about, recently developed by Bright Spots. And you simply choose your configuration file. For this test, I'm going to choose the configuration file for the Minneapolis 2013 mayor's race. So I select it. I get a nice little message saying successfully loaded the configuration file. And now I press tabulation. And again, as I'm talking, the tabulator is loading 80,000 votes and going through 33 rounds of counting. And in just a few seconds, we'll get results from that. And there we go. And you can see that it took 20 seconds, and that's probably because the webinar is hogging my CPU. But anyway, we just tabulated 80,000 votes in 33 rounds and did that in a matter of seconds. What does the output look like? I will show you. Our output comes out in a standard format, standard data format. We have columns for each round of counting. We show a vote total and a percentage, as well as the number of transfers for that candidate in each round. And you can just see through each of the rounds of counting until you get to the end, where our first candidate won with 54 votes to 40. Again, the outputs are pretty straightforward. It's round by round vote totals for every candidate. And one thing I will say about our outputs is that we have designed them in consultation with the Center for Civic Design so that we can feed the outputs of the tabulator into a display program that the Center for Civic Design has developed with seamlessly. So the output of our program goes directly into their online display, and that allows us to look at election results like this, which is generated automatically from the data that we put out. So here's an example of a graphical display of the election results. Each bar represents vote totals for a candidate in a round, and as you go to next rounds, candidates get eliminated, the continuing candidates gain more votes, and in the next slide, you'll see that 2 candidates get eliminated, and that's going to push one of the 2 remaining candidates over the top. So this is the sort of moment of truth in a ranked choice voting election. And lo and behold, Betsy Hodges wins the 2013 Minneapolis mayor's race. Again, this display, developed by the Center for Civic Design, uses the output data, the raw vote totals from our system. So the next steps for our tabulator are to improve the graphical user interface to make it easier to run, easier to configure elections. We want to make sure we've got all of the cast vote record formats currently being used, programmed into our system. We think we're there. And if there's any ranked choice voting parameters that we haven't already programmed in, we'll make sure we have them. We'll do more testing. And then the exciting step is that our intention is to submit the software to an independent testing authority this year, so that when we make this free open source software available to election officials, it will have the stamp of independent testing authority. So now I want you to meet the developers who created this code, and I'll turn it over to them.
Thanks, Caleb. This is John Moldover from the Bright Spots group. I'm in San Francisco here with Hilton and Lewis. We've been working on the Universal Tabulator with Caleb and the Ranked Choice Resource Center, George, since 2017, and the three of us have probably logged about 100 hours of combined work on the weekends and evenings building it. And it's about 2,700 lines of standard Java 9 code, which is pretty small and simple in the world of software products. As Caleb said, it's not that complicated. There are a variety of different rules variations which need to be dealt with carefully, but it's not rocket science. Our goal as software engineers here is to make it as simple, reliable, transparent, performant, and portable as possible, so that you guys and whoever wants to can use it with your existing infrastructure, different voting systems, inputs and output formats. We chose Java as a programming language because it's widely used and supported, and it will be able to be approved. And this will run on Windows, Mac, and Unix systems, no problem. You saw a little bit of the demo of the user interface. Hilton's been developing that, and it's pretty bare bones right now, but you get the idea. It's going to allow you to configure your election, validate all the parameters to it, and execute it, and make sure that the operator can't make any mistakes. We want to keep this as seamless, easy to use as possible. And as Caleb mentioned, we're providing it as free open source code. It'll be available, it actually is currently available to anyone who wants to get it. It's under a BSD 2.0 license, which means anyone who wants to, including election administrators, systems vendors, anyone can use it, modify the code. You can sell it, you can use it for profit, in other copyrighted purposes, kind of whatever you want to do. The purpose is being to just facilitate its usage in everywhere, basically. As Caleb said, we want to support all the major rules variations, input and output formats, and be federally certified in 2018. And I think we're getting close, actually. It's looking good. It's been a fun project to work on, and we're really excited to see it get out and really further the use of ranked choice voting. And that's about all I have on the overview remarks. I'm very happy to answer questions about the nitty-gritty kinds of low-level, coding, engineering stuff if you want, or anything else. So with that, I will pass it back to George, I think, for Q&A.
Yeah, with a few remarks before that, and we'll go to Q&A. But as mentioned, Hilton is currently developing and refining the graphical user interface. John and Lewis are completing the coding now for the multi-winner rules for single transferable vote, so that we can implement the proportional representation features offered by ranked choice voting. Our next major hurdle is getting this tabulation module independently tested to the VVSG standards by an EAC certified lab. The jurisdictions that do not require federal certification are free to use the tabulator now. As noted, it's being offered free open source software and may be downloaded at www.rankedchoicevoting.org/universal RCV tabulator. And if you download it and need help making it work, give us a call. We'll also be happy to work with any RCV jurisdiction to employ the Universal Tabulator as a double check of your current tabulation system. You can either provide us with a copy of your election's cast vote record and the tabulator parameters you employ, or you may download the software and run the tabulation yourself. Such independent verification of RCV tabulations can go a long way toward enhancing transparency and boosting election officials, candidates, and the public's confidence in your ability to effectively and accurately conduct an RCV election. With that, I will hand it back to Karen, and we will be happy to answer any questions that we can. Thank you.
Thanks, George, Caleb, John, and we'll be bringing on Lewis and Hilton as well to make them available for questions. And we do have quite a number of questions, so I think you've generated some excitement, guys. I'm going to leave the Universal Tabulator website address up on the screen for a little bit longer, and then we'll switch over to just the general contact information before we do our wrap up. So now going into the question and answer segment. George, I'll start with you, but you may need to hand it off and feel free. How did you prioritize what forms of ranked choice voting to put into the tabulator software first?
Well, we started out working on Maine, and I think most everyone that's on this call is probably familiar with circumstances there and can understand why we chose that as our priority. Quite frankly, at the time that we started developing this, ES&S did not have its tabulation module, and we wanted to be prepared to provide a tabulation system for the state of Maine in the event that it was needed. Also, Maine used a basic set of rules, tabulation parameters. So that seemed like a good place to start. From there, we've just gone through the list. Both Chris Hughes and I have worked very closely with the Voting Methods Working Group, and we have identified all of the different tabulation parameters that are used in all jurisdictions. So we provided that to the guys at Bright Spots, and then they have just sort of chipped away at it. And I think we've got most everything covered now. I know we're finishing up as I mentioned earlier, we're finishing up the multi-winner coding at this point, and then we will obviously go through it step by step and make sure that we've got everything covered.
George, while I have you, before we get into more technical things, because I know you want to throw those over to Caleb, John, Lewis, and Hilton, can you talk a little more about the certification process? I've got several questions. One is, does it need to be certified state by state? Does the Secretary of State have to approve this tabulator? And is it possible for a municipality or another jurisdiction to use it without state certification? I know you touched on a little bit in your closing remarks, but if you want to get into a little more details for folks.
Oh, sure. And the short and long answer is that depends on the states. The states are the ones that govern election law for the most part. And some states do require EAC certification. Right now, the EAC does not have a process to certify something that's just a tabulation module. They only, quote unquote, certify voting systems. The tabulator is not a voting system. It doesn't record votes. It doesn't present votes. It tabulates cast vote records. So our ability to get actual EAC certification is sort of up in the air, but most states are primarily interested in ensuring that the software that they use meets the VVSG standards, and it has passed muster before one of the independent testing labs. And that's what we anticipate attempting to do, is submitting this to one of the independent testing labs for testing in accordance with the VVSG standards, and then getting such a letter of certification that we can provide to any state or jurisdiction. As far as whether a local jurisdiction can use it to conduct a public election without state approval, that depends entirely on what state law is, what level of independence any jurisdiction has. Some municipalities have the authority to conduct their own elections any way they want. In those kind of situations, then I would presume that they could do so. I would note one thing that we have not mentioned up to this point is that, and I want to thank ES&S for this. I think earlier today the ES&S mentioned that they had been working with us to some degree, and they were very helpful in directing us in how to format the code so that it met VVSG coding standards, just basic coding standards. So John and Lewis went back and revised the code so that we have already covered that part of the deal. It already is coded and formatted in accordance with the VVSG coding standards. So, but as for who can use it, largely governed by state law. And wish us luck with getting independent certification and testing.
That's right. Still some hurdles ahead of us, but we're making good progress.
Not as big a hurdles as there were 3 years ago. That's
exactly right. It's very. I loved hearing John talk about how quickly this had all evolved. I'm going to turn over to Caleb now, and Caleb, there's a question about how is the config file actually generated?
So currently the config file is a JSON file. It's actually just a text file that says, here's the name of the contest, here are the name of the candidates, here are the rules we're using, and the tabulator reads that text file, stores all that information in memory, reads the cast vote records, and does the tabulation. In the future, after we've got our graphical user interface fully functioning, you'll be able to open up the tabulator and say, I've got an election, here's the name, and type it in right into the graphical user interface. You'll be able to define the candidates and so forth without editing a text file. But right now, it's just a simple text file that lists all the parameters for the election.
Well, speaking of parameters, there's that word's in the next question. Since this can be reconfigured to each jurisdiction's RCV parameters, what safeguards are in place so the operator does not make a mistake? Good old human error.
Well, right now we don't have a whole lot of safeguards to do that. In the future, with our graphical user interface, it will make sure that all the parameters are valid. But the main thing is that you've got a single input file that defines the election. You've got a static set of cast vote records, and then you have an output file, which is vote totals, and a log file. So those four files give you a complete auditing record of everything about the election. So the main thing is to examine the configuration file and make sure you had the right settings for the jurisdiction that you're working in. And if you didn't, you switch whatever parameter was off and you rerun it.
And I don't know if Hilton needs to weigh in on any of these things that we're talking about with the interface, but Hilton, you are self-muted, so we need you to unmute yourself if you want to weigh in. There we go. So I'm really not sure who to direct this next question to. I think it's Caleb, but John or Lewis, you might want to weigh in. Is it possible to assure the security of the data between the voting system and the transfer to a computer, since the results are not being tabulated on the voting machine?
So I think the quick answer to that question is the tabulator obviously depends on the integrity of the cast vote records. And so whatever security the jurisdiction uses to move election data around, and in this case, we're talking about moving actual cast vote records around. The ranked choice voting tabulation is only as good as that security. Again, at the point at which we tabulate, we have a configuration file and one or more cast vote record files. All we can say is that we have tabulated correctly based on that. We need to rely on other forms of security and procedures and protocols to ensure that our cast vote records have integrity.
This next question is,
Karen,
yes,
Karen,
George.
If I could mention something like that,
Absolutely.
In the state of Maine, for instance, you're going to actually be moving ballots and moving data records for the municipalities that do have optical scan systems from all over the state to Augusta. And they have procedural protocols in place. They'll probably be using the state troopers to transport the data, and some people trust them more than others. But one thing that we have recommended, and they may try to do this in the future, is generating hash codes for those files at their original location, and then you can verify those hash codes when they reach their destination. That's just one simple way that we can, try to ensure data integrity, particularly when data is being moved across distances, and particularly if it's being moved via the internet. If it's being electronically transmitted to a central location, you would definitely want to do something like that. So thanks.
Oh, thank you, George. I think you're bringing up a good point that there are already transfer of data issues that are being addressed in elections and have to be dealt with, even in our case. So the next question, I think, John or Lewis, you might be best to chime in on this. As you're thinking about the multi-winner coding and so forth, and perhaps I'm even directing it to the wrong person because it does talk about the graphical user interface, Hilton. Will one of you chime in on how is fractional vote reallocation from multi-seat races? How are you considering displaying that in the graphical user interface?
Fractional vote transfer. We use, standard decimal notation as specified by the rules. So, different jurisdictions specify how many decimal places of rounding and what type of rounding. They get real detailed about it. And we take that very seriously, make sure we get it right, do the math right. As far as displaying those numbers go, you just show the number of decimal places that they indicate. And yeah, we're still in the progress of fleshing out all of those variations. But I mean, that's the idea. I think it's pretty straightforward. Hopefully I'm answering the right question there.
Yes, actually, the person who asked that question, which was way over my head, did say that the response on decimal rounding was part of what he was looking for. So thank you.
Sure.
And John, it's correct that in the config file, you can specify the number of decimal places, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's flexibility there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm going to go back a little simpler, something that I understand better. What is the timeline for the self-executing installable files with this? Caleb, you might know best.
Well, I think that's the kind of thing that we can do before we take it to federal testing. So I don't want to speak for Bright Spots because they're the guys who actually have to make it. But I think that, right now we've got the main work is to make sure we've got all the various permutations covered and that we've got an easily usable graphical user interface. And once we get to that, then the installation, I think, won't be a whole lot of more work. But if Bright Spots wants to correct me on any of that, please go right ahead.
That's accurate.
I'll just add to that yeah, our first priority is making sure it's, we support the variations correctly, and that's all tested and verified. And then the second priority is making it as usable as possible. And the installer falls into that category. So it's not at the top of the timeline, but if there was a specific use case for this, we would definitely consider that. So if you're looking for something, you're like, look, my grandma needs to run this on her, such and such laptop, and, we're going to use it, let us know. See if we can make it happen.
Yeah, I don't think it would be too much work to build an installer for this.
I hope too, we've got someone who's asked if there will be a tutorial available. So that might be something else that we have to think about incorporating, a how-to guide or a tutorial, especially when the public wants to do some auditing, which is actually my next question. And George, this may be for you, or the other guys might want to add in. Caleb talked about, and I think you did too, George, about reasons for the tabulator. It's not just something that's been created for election offices or a good coding source for the vendors. You mentioned the public's use of it, and if one of you could talk a little more about why the public would have an interest in this and how they might go about using the tabulator.
Sure, and as far as a tutorial goes, I could use one of those too.
Same here.
Yeah, there are a number of the jurisdictions today, San Francisco being and Minneapolis being primary cases that I'm familiar with, that make their cast vote records. They publish those cast vote records publicly, so that anyone that wants to can verify the published election results. Now, obviously, being able to do that requires some kind of technical expertise. You could sit down and go through them manually, but it would take you weeks or months to do so. So we're trying to provide a tool that anyone can use, that if they set up the parameters for tabulation, set the rules the same way that the law is specified in the local jurisdiction or state or whatever it is, then you can also, if you have access to, if that jurisdiction publishes those cast vote records, as they do in Minneapolis and San Francisco, you can simply download that data, set up the parameters, and run the tabulation yourself and verify that their tabulation was correct. This substantially increases the transparency of elections, and it provides independent verification of election results that have not been a traditional part of our U.S. elections. And I think it's a great step forward, and we'll encourage, we certainly encourage jurisdictions to make those cast vote records public. It in no way jeopardizes the privacy of the vote or reveals whose vote who anyone's vote is. It's just a data set, an anonymous data set. So that's where I see the value there.
And George, I would just add to that I think this universal tabulator has the potential to dramatically increase the integrity of our public elections. And that's because in a ranked choice voting election, you've got an individual electronic record of every single vote cast. And that individual record can be matched back to a ballot that was cast in the proper precinct that corresponds to that vote. So you've got a paper record of the vote in most of these cases, and you've got an electronic record of that ranking. And now what we're saying is a tabulation is going to be performed by a jurisdiction, but citizens can use an independent form of software to double check that tabulation. So you have a software independent verification of the tabulation, and you have the ability to audit every single individual paper ballot. So I think the combination of those two things would be nice if we had them in all public elections, but certainly in ranked choice voting elections, this allows us to increase the integrity of the entire process. And that's whether or not you'd like ranked choice voting. It's about election integrity.
And I can speak to the tutorial question. So it's totally feasible for us to do something like a YouTube video to help people get oriented in installing it and running an example tabulation. I tend to think that it would probably be better for us to just document that. So you have a README file that leads people through it, just because it would be easier to keep that up to date as the user interface changes. But yeah, that's definitely something I'll throw on our list of action items we need to take care of. John, Lewis, do you have anything to add or disagree with me about?
Yeah, I agree. And I think as we improve the user interface, for example, especially making it possible to create and edit election configurations within the UI instead of having to do it in the raw text file, that will make it much easier for non-technical people to operate the software.
Yeah, and to speak to another point, somebody asked earlier if, what safeguards against configuring or creating the config files improperly. I think if you do that, it'll actually throw an error for you when you try to run it. And that is kind of a safeguard in itself.
I think that y'all have really highlighted on what a wonderful development this is and how this is filling a gap that was needed within the election industry and for ranked choice voting. There are actually some great questions that have come in that I think will be better served in the post Q&A document for you guys to follow up on. And I think we're also getting some great suggestions from some experienced administrators. So I think the key thing is just to understand what George mentioned of how far we've come and the excitement of knowing that this is going to be available and is still developing. So with that, I'm going to ask Chris to mute our panelists and allow me to turn it over to Gary Bartlett, who is going to give us a close to our symposium, since this is our final session.
Thank you, Karen. What a fantastic 2 days of information on ranked choice voting. A special thanks to everyone who participated in our 2 days of ranked choice voting symposium, our resource center team, panelists, and you, the listener. Our team tirelessly worked to coordinate and carry out this event. Our panelists shared invaluable information and certainly set the stage for greater things to happen. We look forward to working with them and you, realizing even better ways to improve the conduct of elections in our country. We thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to listen, learn, and also ask insightful questions. Among the symposium participants have been legislators, election administrators, concerned citizens, and academic leaders. We appreciate your care about election processes as much as we do. Let us know how Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center can help you with your implementation, legislation, or simply understanding this voting method, or any other administration and procedures and policies, including outside of ranked choice voting. Today, we learned the capabilities available through our larger voting system vendors. We know that the universal RCV tabulator with open source software can open doors for RCV implementation using legacy voting equipment and when multiple voting systems are used in a jurisdiction or state. Also, greater transparency is possible since the tabulator provides an auditing tool. All our panelists enlighten us how ranked choice voting does not have to be just an idea or a long-term goal. It is possible today and a viable voting method. Thank you again, and we look forward to working with you. Together, we have the ability to make a positive difference in voter participation, having the voters' voice be heard, and ensuring the voters has representative government. Have a great evening, and again, thanks.